is the Dave Pamah Show, a global breakdown of how public systems actually work under pressure and why the same failures show up different in different places around the world. I'm Dave Pamah, a retired firefighter, and this is where lived experience meets system reality. Today, I want to talk about murder. A young man called Henry Nowak, an 18-year-old student, a family that lost a son, a community that was shocked, and a story that has now travelled far beyond Southampton, far beyond the UK, and all the way into the highest levels of politics in both Britain and the United States. Because over the last few days, we've seen an extraordinary public disagreement between Britain's Deputy Prime Minister David Lammy and America's Vice-President JD Vance. And at the centre of that disagreement is a question that comes up again and again across the world. When something terrible happens, who gets to tell the story of why it happened? And what happens when politics start filling in the gaps before the facts do? Now, before we go any further, let's remember what sits underneath all this. A young man is dead. A family is grieving. Nothing I say today should take us away from that reality. Because one of the things I notice more and more in modern public life is how quickly people stop talking about human beings involved and start talking about the political argument. The victim becomes a symbol. The offender becomes a symbol. The tragedy becomes a battleground. And everybody rushes to fit the event into whatever story they already believed before it happened. That's not unique to Britain. That's happening everywhere. So let's start with what actually happened. Henry Nowak was murdered in Southampton. The man convicted of his murder was Vikram Digwa. During the case, Digwa falsely claimed he had been racially abused and acted in self-defence. The court rejected that account. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. The facts established by the court are important because they form the basis upon which society decides responsibility. Not social media, not political speeches, not rumours, the courts. So, with that said, that doesn't mean people can discuss wider issues raised by a case. Or does that mean that? Of course they can. But if we're going to build bigger arguments, they need to be built on facts. Otherwise, we start constructing an entire political narrative on foundations that aren't actually there. And this is where the controversy begins. JD Vance argued that Henry Nowak's death was connected to what he described as mass migration and wider failures by European political elites. Yeah, sorry about the handshake, the speech marks there. This isn't really an audio first podcast, by the way. Anyway, David Lammy responded by saying he was wrong. In fact, Lammy says he personally phoned Vance and told him so. Now that's unusual. Not because politicians disagree. That happens every day. What's unusual is that two senior politicians who are known to have reasonably friendly relationships found themselves publicly disagreeing over the interpretation of a murder. And that's where I think the bigger discussion begins. Because this isn't really about Lammy and Vance like each other. It's not about them liking each other. It's about how societies explain problems. Now, as a firefighter, I spent years attending incidents where people wanted immediate explanations. Why did the fire happen? Who's responsible? Who's to blame? What should be done? People naturally want certainty. The problem is that reality is often more complicated than reality, or more complicated than certainty as well. A fire might involve human behaviour, building design, maintenance failure, regulation, management decisions, economic pressures, training issues, resource shortages, and pure bad luck. Usually it's a combination. Systems rarely fail because of one thing. They fail because several things line up at the same time. And I think exactly the same principle applies here. One thing I've learned over the years is that public debate often looks for a single cause. Real life really provides one. People want one answer because one answer feels manageable. One answer gives us someone to blame. One answer makes the world feel simpler. But systems don't work like that. Societies don't work like that. Human behaviour certainly doesn't work like that. Now, let's talk about something people often don't see. Every major tragedy creates a vacuum, and vacuums get filled. Sometimes by facts, sometimes by emotions, sometimes by politics, sometimes by misinformation. The bigger the public shock, the faster that process happens. You see it after terror attacks. You see it after riots. You see it after murders. You see it after disasters. Because before investigators have finished their work, narratives are already competing for attention. And once a narrative becomes emotionally powerful, it can become very difficult to reverse, even when new information appears. This is not just a British phenomenon. Look around the world. In the United States, individual crimes often become symbols in wider arguments about race, immigration, policing, or gun laws. In France, violent incidents quickly become part of debates about integration and national identity. In Germany, crime stories can become arguments about migration policies. In Sweden, discussions around organised crime have become intertwined with immigration debates. In Australia, Canada, and elsewhere, the same pattern appears. Different countries, different politics, same system behaviour. A shocking event occurs. People search for meaning. Political actors connect the event to a wider story. The public divides into camps. And eventually, people start arguing about the story more than the incident itself. That's the pattern. And once you see it, you can't really unsee it. Now, let's talk about policing. Because there was another part of this case that attracted significant public attention. Body cam footage showed officers handcuffing Henry Nowak while he was dying after the offender falsely acclaimed he was the victim. That image generated enormous public anger. And understandably so. Because when ordinary people see something like that, their immediate reaction is straightforward. How could that happen? Why didn't officers realise? Why wasn't the situation understood immediately? These are reasonable questions. But again, we have to understand how systems work under pressure. Frontline decision making is often ugly. It's messy. It's incomplete. It's fast. People make decisions with limited information. Sometimes seconds matter. Sometimes information is wrong. Sometimes witnesses are wrong. And sometimes offenders lie. Sometimes victims can't speak. And sometimes chaos overwhelms the scene. Now, none of that means mistakes shouldn't be examined. Of course they should. Accountability matters. Learning matters. Public confidence matters. But understanding reality matters too. One of the dangers in modern discussion is that people often analyse frontline decisions with information that only becomes available after or even later. That's not how the people at the scene experienced it. They were operating inside uncertainty, and uncertainty changes everything. Again, firefighters understand this. Police officers understand this. Paramedics understand this. Emergency call handlers understand this. The public usually sees the finished story. Frontline workers experience the unfinished ones. That's a huge difference. Now, let's move to another issue. Political leadership. Because whether you agree with David Lammy or JD Vance, both men are doing something that leaders often do. They're trying to explain what a tragic event means. Not just what happened, what it means. And those are two very different things. The facts tells us what happened. Interpretation tells us what it means. Policy tells us what should happen next. The danger is when those three things become blurred together. Because once that happens, public trust starts to suffer. People stop knowing where facts end and politics begins. And when trust falls, institution struggles. That's one of the biggest challenges facing democracies today. Trust. Not just trust in politicians, trust in courts, trust in police, trust in media, trust in government, trust in experts, trust in information itself. And when trust declines, every incident becomes a battleground. Every event becomes contested. Every fact becomes questioned. You can see that happening all over the world. And it's becoming one of the defining challenges of modern public life. Because institution relies on legitimacy. People don't follow systems simply because systems exist. They follow them because they believe the systems are broadly fair. Once that belief weakens, the pressure starts building. Now, something else caught my attention. Henry Nowak's father publicly appealed for calm. Think about that for a moment. A father who has lost his son, a man carrying unimaginable grief. And yet, he asked people not to use the tragedy to create further division. Whether people agree with every aspect of the debate or not, that's a powerful intervention. Because families understand something that public debates forgets. The human cost comes first. Politics comes later. In many ways, families are often the last people left defending reality. Because while everyone else argues about narratives, they still have to live with the consequences every day, every year, for the rest of their lives. Now, let's zoom in, or zoom out, I should say, globally. Because this isn't really a story about Britain. It's not really a story about America either. It's a story about how modern societies process shock. And increasingly, They process shock through politics, through social media, through identity, through tribal loyalty, through ideological filters. The result is that people can look at exactly the same event and see completely different things. One person sees policing failure, another sees migration failure, another sees political failure, another sees media failure, another sees institutional decline, another sees social breakdown. Everybody is looking at the same incident, but they're looking through different lenses. And that's where leadership matters. Not because leaders eliminate disagreement, that's impossible, but because good leadership helps people distinguish between facts, interpretation, and policy. Those boundaries matter. Without them, confusion grows. And confusion is really good for public trust. As somebody who spent decades working in emergency services, I've become increasingly interested in one simple question. What happens when systems are under pressure? Because that's when you discover what they really are. Not during the easy days, not when everything is functioning smoothly. You learn about systems during crisis. You learn about organisations during failures. You learn about societies during moments of tension. Pressure reveals reality. And that's exactly why stories like this matter. Not because they're political, not because they're controversial, but because they show us how institutions, leaders, media organisations and communities respond when emotions and pressures collide. That's where the lessons are. So when I look at this story, the question I keep coming back to isn't whether David Lammy was right or whether JD Vance was right. The question is bigger than that. It's this: can modern societies still separate facts from narrative long enough to understand what actually happens? Because if we really lose that ability, every tragedy becomes a political weapon. Every victim becomes a symbol, and every public conversation becomes harder. The challenge isn't simply finding answers. The challenge isn't finding the right answers. And that takes patience. It takes evidence. It takes accountability. And sometimes it takes the discipline to admit that reality is more complicated than we'd like it to be. That's not always satisfying, but it's usually closer to the truth, and truth matters. Especially when emotions are running high, especially when people are grieving, and especially when public trust is already under pressure. Because when you're looking at Britain, America, France, Germany, Canada, Australia, or anywhere else in the world, the pattern keeps repeating. A tragedy occurs, narrative forms, politics moves in, trust gets tested, institution comes under pressure, and society tries to make sense of what happens. Different countries, different cultures, different governments, same patterns. Again and again. And that's why these conversations matter. Not to score political points, not to pick teams, but to better understand how public systems actually functions when they're under strain. Because the more we understand the system, the better equipped we are to improve it. Because whether it's here in the UK or anywhere else in the world, these systems don't fail in isolation. They fail in patterns. And once you understand the pattern, you start to see it everywhere. This is the Dave Pamah Show.